This incident happened last August, when it was still hot outside, but half of the leaves on half the trees had taken on their autumn colors. After eating breakfast, Eric went outside and headed for his friend, Sam. After walking a few streets, he was already at his destination. In front of him was the country house where Sam and his parents lived, but it wasn't much different from the house Eric's family lived in. The roof was a different color, and the windows were a little closer together. But this story is not about architecture. So, after looking around the front lawn of his friend's house for a while, Eric moved to the door and knocked. A moment later, the door opened, and Sam appeared on the threshold. He shook his friend's hand and invited him in. A few minutes later, the two friends were walking away from their town and headed toward the woods. On the way, they checked in their minds to make sure they had not forgotten anything for their overnight trip to the woods. After questioning each other about the contents of their backpacks, they continued on their way and were on their way to the forest, which was about 20 minutes away. After walking through the woods and getting deep enough into the thicket, they chose a place to set up their tent and make a fire. While Eric set up the tent, Sam disappeared among the trees to gather firewood. After setting up the tent and supplies, and building a fire, the boys heated soup and canned stew, occasionally bantering with each other like normal 17-year-olds. Eventually the sun disappeared behind the trees, and twilight fell in the forest. The friends decided to tickle their nerves by telling scary stories. Before they knew it, it was totally dark and the night birds were singing. "Boo!" cried Sam. "I should call my parents so they wouldn't worry." Eric nodded in agreement, and they picked up their phones and told their parents that everything was okay and they were about to go to bed. "Yeah, right about now," Sam chuckled as he finished talking to his family and threw another pile of twigs into the fire. "Whoa!" Eric burst out, "We're out of firewood." "Let's go," said the other one. They were out in the bush, gathering more or less suitable branches for the fire, shining their flashlights in the pitch darkness. They separated a little, but they kept turning around to make sure they didn't lose each other. At one point Eric stopped noticing the silhouette of his partner and decided to call out to him, but after a couple of calls he heard only silence instead of an answer. The boy thought that his friend had gone to their place of rest. He went over to the tent and checked inside and called for Sam a few more times, but just like the last time, no one responded. Eric felt uncomfortable, afraid for his friend and for himself, too. The horror stories he'd heard before kept coming back to him. When he had gathered his thoughts, he switched on the flashlight and went in search of it. He walked among the trees and shouted at the top of his voice, but he saw no flashlight light, no answer, and not even the singing of the birds. There was complete silence and darkness all around, which the frightened teenager's pocket lantern pierced with a bright beam. After wandering around some more and calling out to his buddy, Eric decided to return to the fire. As he approached the tent, a smile spread across his face. He remembered that he could call the missing man. He fumbled for the phone in his pocket and with trembling hands found the number in the call list, pressed the call button. The receiver beeped, but to his deepest disappointment, the phone rang from the tent. Eric angrily threw the phone on the grass, sat down and cried. Suddenly there was a crunching of branches from the woods, and then Sam ran up. He was out of breath, covered in dirt, with frightened eyes. He ran up to Eric and told him that while they were gathering firewood, he saw a beast in the woods that chased him, had to run, and then he got lost when he looked for his way back. The heart of the busy lad's search was soothed. After Sam's story, the friends finished their canned dinner and also roasted marshmallows on the fire, and finally, after drinking tea with a nice dessert, they went to bed. In the middle of the night Eric awoke to someone pushing him on the shoulder. It was Sam, and there was a grimace of horror on his pale face. He said, "That's it," and jabbed his finger at the wall of the tent. It was cut, but there were several cuts in a row, as if someone had struck it with a clawed paw. The teenagers became seriously worried. Eric pulled the hunting knife his father had given him out of his backpack and clutched it tightly in his hand. An eerie roar cut through the quiet forest night, unlike a bear's or anyone else's. It discouraged the last urge to get out of their abode. Something collapsed a few meters away, and then the approaching footsteps of the beast could be heard. The leaves rustled under its every step, but it walked slowly, as if sneaking up on its prey, letting its own fear soak in. The boys' hearts seemed to beat a tap in their chests. They huddled against the back wall of the tent and waited. Eric put his knife forward menacingly. The creature seemed about to tear the wall of the tent and then the bodies of the two young individuals inside it. The beast came so close to the tent that it could be seen, and it froze. It resembled the figure of a lean, very tall man, whose fingers and arms were much longer than normal human ones. On his fingers were huge, curved claws, which he apparently used to cut through the tent. After waiting, the creature took a few more steps and leaned over the tent. With a wave of his hand, one side of the tent was torn off and tossed aside. That was the last straw, and Sam, with a wild howl, turned on the flashlight and rushed forward. The monster, crawling roughly, ran after him. He saw it, and the knife-wielding lad ran out of the tent too, and disappeared into the thicket. The contacts in the flashlight kept coming loose, and Sam had to shake it constantly. He could hear the branches in the trees breaking behind him and its wheezing breathing. The creature kept getting closer, and there was another flashlight glitch. In the total darkness, Sam didn't see the root, tripped over it, and collapsed sharply on the ground, moaning in pain. The thing jumped over the guy's body, stopped, and jumped on him. Meanwhile, on the other side of the woods, Eric was explaining to his parents what had happened and asking them to get him and his friend out of here as quickly as possible. As soon as he hung up, he heard Samuel's heartbreaking scream and ran in the direction, looping among the trees. He tried to see the light of the flashlight with which his friend had rushed frantically, and there, somewhere far away in the trees, was a beam of white light. Eric rushed over there, but as he approached he was shocked to see the huge pool of blood in which the source of the light lay. Eric, after standing there for a few seconds, came to his senses and flashed his heels, trying to get as far away from the ghastly sight as possible. Finally lost and out of breath, he crouched exhausted on a fallen tree and wept. Tears rolled down his cheeks. He could not believe that his friend had been dragged away by a clawed animal, and that he himself would probably never see his parents and little sister again. He was brought to his senses by a bright light that could be seen somewhere in the distance. The light was followed by the sound of a klaxon, and the boy guessed that it was probably his parents coming to get him. The boy got up and went toward the sound. His father got out of the car and started calling for him and his other friend. As he ran up to the car, Eric threw himself on top of his father and dug into his shirt. He could not stop crying. Richard, that was Eric's father's name, asked where Sam was, and his son told him everything he had seen and led him to the spot where he had seen the pool of blood. With his father, the boy was hardly afraid anymore, and he even began to believe that they could find Samuel and everything would be alright. It was lightning in the woods and the birds were singing. Richard shook hands with the missing man's father and took him aside to talk. "Hannah, take the boy home, he must be exhausted," Sam's father said to his wife behind the wheel. Eric sat down in the front seat and passed out. Waking up in the evening, the boy learned from his mother that his friend had still not been found, even though the police and neighbors were involved in the search. A week later the search stopped. All they could find was the sleeve from Sam's bike. Everything that Eric had told the police, his classmates, and parents were blamed on a fright and attributed to a hungry bear. There were no bears within 50 kilometers.